Well, welcome back to the channel. In the last video I gave you all the detail about the third phase of the system of car control, which is the speed phase. In this video we're going to cover the gear phase, the fourth phase of IPSC. I'm going to talk about manual cars, automatic cars, a little bit about electric cars, although they don't have a gearbox, but I'll explain what I mean. So just a reminder, a bit of a memory jogger, there's 5 phases to the system of car control. There's an information phase that runs out throughout the system where we take, use and give information. There's a position phase where you get your correct position on approach to a hazard. Remember, this is where we apply the system on the approach to hazards, anything that we have to deal with on the road. After the position phase is the speed phase, where we reduce our speed if we need to deal with the hazard. Then there's a gear phase, then there's an acceleration phase at the end. There's the information phase, 4 action phases, and we don't always have to do anything at the action phases, we just have to consider them. So, we're on the gear phase. Oops, nearly missed the speed limit. We're on the gear phase. How many of you, when you're slowing down, do this? I'll just do that again, and I'll do it while I'm braking. How many of you do this? And then accelerate. Sequentially changing down through the gears as you're braking. I see it a lot. I see it in people who've not had any advanced driver training before. Now, I like to analyse why people do things and what they're for. Now, in my view, changing down sequentially 5, 4, 3, 2 while you're braking is pointless. There's no point to it, it doesn't add anything. And I ask people why they do it, and most of the time it's just habit. It's just either they've been taught how to do it or it's habit. The real reason that they do that is so that the car is then in the right gear when they finish braking. So if I brake on approach to this, there's a humpback bridge coming up. I know there's a lorry coming towards us, but I think we'll be there before it. So if I brake here and go third, and then I brake, I'm still braking, I go to second because the car's slowing down. So yeah, subconsciously what people are doing when they're changing sequentially down through the gearbox is they know that when they finish braking the car will be in the right gear. But you know what, it's a lot of faffing about, isn't it? It's a lot of doing things. I like to separate driving out at the top of the dashboard, and there's everything that's happening above the dashboard, which is everything out there, all the stuff that we have to deal with, and there's everything below the dashboard. And if we can minimise what we're doing below the dashboard, if we can reduce our workload to a minimum, it leaves us more spare mental capacity to deal with what's happening down there, to look in the distance, to make driving plans, to work out what's going to happen. A little bit like that lorry back there, saw it in the distance, realised he'd need some space, pull over and get out of the way. We didn't just barrel into that situation. So why then do we overload ourselves with all this workload of braking, going from 6th to 5th to 4th to 3rd, pressing the clutch, matching the revs, all that kind of stuff, when in reality all you need to do is what I'm going to do for this corner up here. I'm going to apply the system, I'm going to get my position right on approach, I've taken information in, got my position right on approach, I'm going to brake once, I'm going to change gear once, and then I'm going to accelerate around the corner. How much easier is that? That is so much easier, isn't it? We brake once and we change gear once. So I'm in a manual car. How do I choose what gear I want to be in? Well, I'm going to remind you of one of my favourite words, and that word is flexibility. When I arrive at the hazard, if I've reduced my speed, I'm going to choose a gear that gives me flexibility to drive through that hazard. So it's not such a high gear that the car's going to be labouring and struggling. It's not such a low gear that the car's going to be bouncing off the rev limiter. For this one here, 3rd gear. It's nice and flexible, gives me plenty of pull around the corner, but it's not right up at the top end of the rev limit either. I'm not running out of revs as I come out of the corner. Now, a lot of people say, well, what gear should I be in at this situation and that situation? Every car's different. You've got to learn your car, you've got to learn what the appropriate gears are for different situations. Now, ideally, in a manual car, we are looking to brake once and change gear once, and that's it. Now, there's some temporary traffic lights will be a good chance that they're going to be on red, and I'm in 5th gear at the moment, doing 50-55 miles an hour, something like that. So we're easing off, we're braking down, and all I'm going to do is brake to a stop and press the clutch. And now I'm going to put it into first gear, ready to go. Brake once, change gear once, even if we're coming to a stop. It's so easy. It's so much less faffing about than changing down through the gearbox. Now some people say, well, you're pressing the clutch there in fifth gear, it's really early, you're coasting. No, I'm not. This isn't coasting. This is part of a planned approach to dealing with a hazard. So here's the first thing you need to know about the gear phase. Pressing the clutch to stop the car from juddering because you're coming down to a lower speed in a higher gear, that is not changing gear. It's not overlapping the braking and the gear change. All you're doing is pressing the clutch. And it's not coasting because you're doing it for a specific reason for a very short period of time. Back then that clutch was down for maybe a second before we came to a stop. That's all. That's not coasting. So all these people who say, I'm coming off a motorway slip road and, well, I'm braking down and then I need an intermediate gear to get me to the roundabout. No, you don't. No, you don't. Press the brakes once. If the car gets down to tick over speed, just press the clutch. It's not coasting and it'll only be down for a second or two. That's all you need. Now let's deal with this thing that most people struggle with, and I'll be honest, I struggled with this when I first started doing this type of driving, which was about, if I'm being honest, 32 years ago now, when I did my first police standard driving course. And that thing, that real mental block, that thing that people struggle with, is eliminating the overlap between braking and changing gear. Now first off, I want to remind you of something. You are allowed to overlap your braking and changing gear. It is in there. If you look at the schematic of system, there is a bit of an overlap between braking and changing gear. And that's because in certain circumstances, we don't want to get off the brakes. If you're going downhill towards a junction, in fact, I'm going to go downhill towards a corner here. It's exaggerated a little bit, but I'm going downhill. If I brake here and then come off the brakes, the car's going to pick up speed. So I'll keep the brakes on, overlap and change gear. I planned to do it. I did it for a reason. That's absolutely fine. It's part of a planned approach. But 99% of the time, when we're approaching a hazard, it is better to brake, finish your braking and then change gear. For the reasons I gave before, we're minimising your workload. We're separating the system out. We're doing one thing after another after another. We're not mixing everything up and blending it all together. So on approach to this right-hander down here, I'll show you what I mean. We're going to have a little bit of brakes on approach there in fifth gear. I'm going to finish the braking, take fourth gear and then drive it round. Watch that back if you want and ask yourself, how difficult or how easy was that? And the answer is, it's really easy. It's really easy. Because I just do one thing, then the next, then the next. So in the previous video, I talked about braking and how to brake using three-phase braking to get the speed of the car correct early enough to give you time to get the gear. This is the secret. The secret to eliminating overlap is not in the gear change, it's in the braking. So get your braking right, you'll then have enough time to do a nice smooth gear change into the gear that you want. Now in the old blue roadcraft, I'm talking about pre-94, pre-93, pre-94 roadcraft, they used to have rules for gear changing, and I'm racking my brains now to try and remember what they were, but there was something like, to make all gear changes smoothly, which I'll talk about in a minute, to know the maximum road speed for each gear in the car that you're driving. Yeah, fair enough. The big one was to always be in the correct gear for the speed that you're driving at. That's the big one, the correct gear for the speed. And the correct gear is just a flexible one. Fifth gear here, but I'm going down to fourth gear to give me some flexibility on the hill. What I am not doing is using the gear to slow me down. That's engine braking, it's to be avoided. I talked about it in the last video about the speed phase. Go and watch that, I explain it all in there. Now in terms of changing gear smoothly in a manual car, there's a few things you can do, and I have made videos about this before and I'll put a link in the description below, but I'll just recap what we're aiming to do with the gear changes. Any shunt in a gear change, any jerkiness in a gear change comes from a difference between the engine speed and the road speed through the gearbox when you release the clutch. So as much as possible, we're going to try and match the engine speed to the road speed for the next gear that we're taking. And we do that with the accelerator pedal. There's a couple of other things we need to do as well. Don't just change direct from one gear to another. Always acknowledge neutral. Remember, you're taking it out of the gear, putting it into neutral, you're taking it out of neutral, you're putting it into the gear. You're not just going from third to fourth, you are going from third to neutral and from neutral to fourth. Now you don't need to double declutch these days, that's an old-fashioned technique. Not necessary these days to press the clutch twice. We've got nice synchromesh gearboxes that work really well, that make gear changing nice and easy, but there is a benefit in just pausing at neutral. If you do one thing to smooth your gear changes out, slow them down. Don't rush that gear change through, don't bang it through. And if you finish your braking in enough time, you'll be able to smooth it out, you'll be able to slow it down because you've given yourself enough time. First to second when you're setting off is a difficult one to get smooth, just take your time. Another little tip, pause the acceleration before you change gear. So I'll accelerate now up to 30 miles an hour in a second, and then I'll pause the acceleration just before I change up. That allows the gearbox to relax, it makes a nice smoother gear change, and I take my time. And the other thing I want you to do when you're changing down through the gearbox is just raise the revs gently to match. So I'll go up to fourth gear here for this right-hander, a position right on approach, get my speed right, and then as I change down, you'll hear the revs go up just very slightly. That brings the engine up to the right speed for the next lower gear, third gear, and it smooths the gear change out. You can cheat in this car because it's got auto rev match when you're in sport mode, but if I take it out of sport mode, I'll just prove to you I can do it myself. So I'm going to go from fourth to third, nice and smooth, just raise the revs. I'm going to go from third to second at 45. You can hear the revs go up, it's a nice smooth gear change. You don't feel the gear change, you can just hear it. But if you've got a car that automatically rev matches, it's a little bit annoying that it's better than me, it's more consistent than me, but it is a really nice system. So if you've got a Mini JCW, if you've got any kind of modern Porsche with a manual gearbox, automatic rev matching, it's a bit annoying, but it's really good, so leave it on. Now, automatics, let's talk about the gear phasing automatics. I want your timing to be the same as it is in the manual car. Finish your braking with enough time for the car to get the gear. Now, modern automatic gearboxes don't need that much time to get the gear. They'll match you with a nice flexible gear, nice and early. If you're on a road like this, I would tend to put the car into sport, because in sport mode it will hold the lower gears longer, it'll rev the engine out a bit more, it'll get into that sweet spot, that sort of power band of the engine if you like, and it'll change you down to a lower gear when you're slowing for corners. That'll give you better control through the corners. Doesn't make the car any faster, it just holds the lower gears a bit longer and changes down a bit earlier to a lower gear. But sport mode is well worth trying out. If you're around town, if you're cruising on the motorway, you might not want to use sport mode, it might not suit that. But on a road like this, I'd definitely be in sport mode now in an automatic. And pretty much all automatics these days give you a manual override on the gears. It'll either be on the gear stick where you move it backwards and forwards, or it'll be on paddles behind the steering wheel, or a combination of both. A lot of cars you could do both. That DCT engined M2 that I used to have, you could do it with both the paddles and with the gear shifter. Now we're going to drive those in the same way as we're driving the manual car. If we're going to drive it in manual mode, I want you to get your speed right and then get your gear right. And usually it's the right paddle for changing up, it's the left paddle for changing down. So if you slow down and you want to go down 2 gears, just pull the paddle twice. But get your speed right first, then tap it down 2. Now to be fair, these type of gearboxes, these DCT gearboxes or these flappy paddle gearboxes, whatever you want to call them, they do allow you to brake and change gear at the same time, and the car will rev match, and it's all very nice. But if we're driving systematically, speed first, then the gear. So rather than going brakes, down one gear, stay on the brakes, down another gear, I would brake and then tap it down 2 gears. And the car will give you a nice seamless gear change down to the gear that you want. The other thing you need to be aware of in automatic cars is kick down. So kick down is when you press the accelerator quite hard and the car will recognise that you are looking for a bit more acceleration, and it will automatically change down to a lower gear. Now, it used to be a switch underneath the accelerator pedal that would literally click when you kicked down. These days it's more sophisticated. Half press on the accelerator, depending what mode you're in, will give you 1 or 2 gear changes down. And it's much more eager to kick down in sport mode. Now that can spoil a drive sometimes. Get to a corner like this, if you press the gas too hard, it'll kick down halfway around the corner. Doesn't quite feel right. Doesn't feel as nice as it would do in a manual car. So learn your car, learn where it'll kick down. Learn how much or how little accelerator to use. But the biggest thing with automatics is don't brake all the way up to the hazard. The fault, I describe the fault as linear braking. People apply the brakes and just hold the brakes at a single point right the way up to the hazard. And then they're literally just coming off the brakes as they turn into the junction or turn onto the roundabout. That's not systematic driving. You're not giving the car time to get the gear. You're not giving the car time to settle off the brakes. So always aim to finish your braking with enough time to let the car get the gear. Yes, it's automatic, but we want to let the car settle. In an electric car, I would rewrite system. I would not have a gear phase, specifically because electric cars don't have a gearbox. They don't have gears. It's pretty much direct drive from the engine to the wheels. Somebody will tell me there's some kind of drive or whatever it goes in. I don't know. I don't know the technicalities of it, but there's no gearbox. There's nothing for you to change. There's no step up. The engine doesn't rise up in revs and drop and rise and drop. It's just direct drive. All the torque is there all the time. It's available to you. So when you finish your speed phase, remember to have a little pause. Remember to wait just for a moment to let the car settle. So instead of a gear phase, I would have a settle phase. Let the car settle down from back on onto its rear axle from slowing down before you start the acceleration phase. There is one other gearbox I've not mentioned actually. There's loads and loads of gearboxes, and actually, you know, you need to know your own car. But there's one other specific type of gearbox called a CVT. And a CVT is a continually variable transmission. And the original one that you might have heard of if you're an old fart like me is the DAF Variamatic, those old DAF cars in the 60s and 70s. But there are more modern iterations of this. I know Mitsubishi, I think Subaru have played around with CVT gearboxes. Effectively, they work like a rev and rip moped, where there is a belt system or a chain system inside the transmission, and it's attached to 2 cone-shaped wheels. And as you drive, the belt or the chain moves up and down these cones and gives you a continually variable transmission. They're a bit weird to drive. I'm not a big fan of them, but they are apparently the most effective and most efficient transmissions that you can get anywhere. Williams F1 tried one in the early 90s, David Coulthard driving, they tested it. It was very effective, but it sounded weird because what it does is instead of the engine going up and down, revving up and revving down again as you change gear, what happens is the transmission does all that changing. So the engine will sit at one specific rev and it'll be the most efficient rev point. So it might sit at 3,000 revs and the car will pick up speed and it'll lose speed, but the engine will stay at 3,000 revs. So it sounds a bit weird. It's like a drone rather than revving up and revving down. But the way to drive CVT gearboxes is just to understand them. They will kick down in a little, you know, if you press the accelerator hard, it'll very quickly change the transmission to give you a lower ratio and give you more acceleration. But in terms of systematic driving, just remember, get your speed right first. That continually variable transmission will adjust itself to give you the right ratios for the speed that you're driving at. So when you move on to the acceleration phase, the transmission is set. I haven't got access to one of those. If you want to lend me one, well, drop me an email. Maybe we'll make a video on a CVT transmission. very easy to drive. You get in and drive them just like an automatic. Some of them replicate manual gears, so they will let the engine rev up and down a little bit, which really is somehow that's defeating the object of the gearbox. But I think Honda did one that would rev up and down and give you different ratios, or you could set and hold the ratios yourself. But again, it sort of defeats the object of a CVT transmission, that. So that's it for the gear phase. The gear phase sets you up for the last phase, which is acceleration, which is what I'll talk about in the last video of this little series. But I hope you found that useful. I'll put a link in the description below to all my other videos about changing gear, gear choice, engine braking, all that kind of stuff. So don't forget to go and have a look at the website, reglocal.com. There's loads more information there about advanced and performance driving and riding, information about the books that I've written, how you can get hold of a copy, and about how you can get a day's driver or rider coaching with me if you fancy a drive out or a ride out on some of these roads. There's nowhere nicer in Britain, is there? Come on. Drop me an email, we'll see if we can sort something out. I've got a lot of bookings this year. But for now, thanks for watching. Hope you've enjoyed it, got something out of it. We'll see you in the next one.